Okay, so I suggest we start. As you can see, we are recording live, and also we are live on Facebook. Our other guest speaker will join us in a bit, hopefully, due to some technical problems. Welcome to all of the colleagues that are today with me, and welcome to all of the participants that already joined. I think others will join in the next minutes. I'm Christella. I'm an environmental scientist, and I'm in charge of leading the EU Net Restoration project together with the YEE and WWF. And this webinar is organized by both of the organizations. I'm very happy to see that some of the participants have already a background, either educational or through their work, in the environmental issues. And I hope this webinar will benefit to your interest. And thank you very much for finding the time to attend it with us today. And just for your information, for people who don't know much about the topic or about the project itself, I would like to give a bit of contextual background and why we are sitting today on this webinar and talking about the EU Net Restoration. The reason is that in the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, the European Commission announced that it would propose legally binding EU Net Restoration targets to restore biodiversity and degraded ecosystems, in particular those with the biggest potential to restore carbon and to prevent and reduce the impact of natural disasters. The process is like that. The European Commission, it's expected to propose this law formally by the end of this year. And then the Council of Europe and the European Parliament will review it and amend it, the proposal in the co-decision process next year. So we are at a very delicate moment, and we want to make use of our power to influence this decision. And that's why this project is for. The WWF welcomed this proposal as a key to contribute to halting and restoring biodiversity loss for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And it's collaborating with YEE as the largest network of youth organizations in Europe. And of course, part of the project that has been running for some months already is also the advocacy work. In the context of advocacy work, we are both collaborating with a purpose to include the young people in decision-making process on climate and to empower them to become part of a constructive participation in discussion on biodiversity restoration with stakeholders and decision makers. So this webinar today is practically a chance for our guest speakers to present the key messages in the topic and the importance of it, both from the legal and scientific perspective. And also they have the chance to hear your views and answer your questions. And from the other side, you as participants have a chance to write on the chat your questions and your comments regarding the topic. And later today on the agenda, we have a time frame dedicated to a discussion and the question and answers part. Also, for your information, I wanted to tell you about the previous event that we had in the context of a project that was a relay in Brussels. It was 27 runners presenting symbolically 27 European member countries taking part on a run, where at the end they handed over a symbol of nature restoration to the European Environmental Commissioner Sinkevicius, together with a message to urge him to present a law that is credible, ambitious, and targeted in order to make a difference and bring back Europe's nature for the people and the planet. And for this project, we have been working together with my colleague from WWF. He's the communications officer for biodiversity of agriculture. Bartosz Pesicki, I'll give you the floor to say a few words for your involvement and for why WWF involvement in the nature restoration law. Please.
Thank you, Christella. Hello, everyone. Yes, so like Christella mentioned, I work for WWF's European Policy Office. The European Policy Office, EPO, is a sort of an embassy for the global WWF network at the EU level. So we advocate, because EU policies affect, well, hugely member states in the EU, and around, I think, 80% of your environmental laws in member states are in one way or another, well, they depend on the EU. So we advocate for EU laws that will put the EU on a sustainable path for nature and for people, for the planet. And so we see the nature restoration law as a sort of a game changer, because protecting nature, protecting remaining natural ecosystems will not be enough to reverse biodiversity loss. It will not be enough to address climate change. And so this nature restoration law, we see it as a potential game changer if done right. So we, like Christelle mentioned, we've partnered with YEE, and we also work with a coalition of NGOs, other NGOs, including European Environmental Bureau and BirdLife Europe, to advocate for a strong law, for a strong nature restoration law. And so we've done this event about a month ago in Brussels, this run with youth organizations, YEE, as one of our key partners. And yeah, and today we're helping organize this workshop to inform and to give you the tools you need to, and the knowledge to advocate for this law, because even the Commission considers youth in this debate to be hugely, the voice of the youth to be hugely important. So so hopefully you'll find this interesting and informative, and I'll hand back to Christella.
Thank you for the introduction, Bartosz. I think we can go ahead with one of our guest speakers. She's Laura Hild. I'm very happy to have her part of the YEE family, but she's also the policy officer for biodiversity and European Union affairs at the European Environmental Bureau, focusing on the follow-up implementation of the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, and also ecological restoration and implementation of the Natures Directive. And Laura, since she has a legal background, will be talking to us today about the general policy context and legal elements, always in the topic of nature restoration. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christella. I was just trying to also share my screen at the same time, so the buttons moved. Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Laura. I work for the EEB. For those of you who don't know us, the EEB is the largest network of environmental civil society organizations, and for example, YEE is also a member of us, and so are many national level environmental organizations that you may be familiar with. I put together a few slides. I hope that's helpful. Can you see them? Okay, I see some nodding. That's great. I'm going to put them in presentation mode so that you hopefully see them more clearly, and I'm just going to keep an eye on the time as well. So yes, I will focus a bit on the policy context and legal context of the upcoming EU nature restoration law, and also on the opportunities that still arise for advocacy efforts at the moment, and to tell you a bit about where the process currently stands. So to start off, Christella already mentioned it at the beginning, that the commitment for this law comes from the EU's biodiversity strategy for 2030. The strategy was released in May last year, and in it there was a commitment that the Commission will put forward a proposal for legally binding EU nature restoration targets to restore degraded ecosystems, and particularly focus on those with benefits for carbon storage and capture. The proposal is now planned for early 2022, so there's a bit of a delay because it's been difficult to agree on some, or there are still some outstanding issues, which of course, while it's really crucial that we address the biodiversity crisis in a timely and urgent manner, we are not so critical about, because it's important that this proposal is really strong, because this law is a really crucial opportunity, as has already been mentioned. So now there's the work in the last few months. There's been a lot of work going on within the Commission, but also with a lot of stakeholders being involved on preparing the draft and working on what this law should look like. So I would like to very briefly give you an overview as to where things stand at the moment in terms of what the Commission is currently planning, and then to go a bit into what we as NGOs in a coalition, as Bartosz has also mentioned, with BirdLife, WWF, and also Kind Earth, are asking from the law, and to go a bit into where some of the problems maybe still lie. So starting with the Commission's approach so far, or what we know about it, the Commission is planning, in terms of having these restoration targets, is planning to probably have some sort of overarching objective that will be rather fluffy though, with a timeline for 2050, and then more specific targets for specific ecosystems for 2030, 40, and 50. And within those targets, they're planning to focus quite a lot on degraded areas, and I'll come back to why that is a bit of a problem. But also, I think important to note is that the Commission is planning a sort of two-phase approach for this law, where in a first phase, they would propose targets on some habitats and then additional targets in a second phase later on. And I think I've put in here a Commission slide that illustrates this quite nicely. I'm not going to go into the details of all of this, but I thought this might be useful to also come back to. So the plan is, in a first step, to put forward definitions, of course, as to what restoration would actually mean, what the aim of the law is, and so on. To have probably or potentially an overarching objective as such for ecosystem restoration, so point B, and then more specific targets for ecosystems. But for those ecosystems only for which data and monitoring mechanisms are currently already available. And for those where that's not the case, so that's point D, the first step would entail an obligation to establish this data, to work on monitoring mechanisms, and to, through that, establish a process to then assess the conditions of ecosystems where you currently don't have the system in place. Point E relates to requirements on to aid the implementation of the law, so funding, but also national restoration plans that will help to translate the EU level obligation to the national level. Then in a step 2, there would, for those ecosystems that are not covered already in step 1 and where monitoring mechanisms and so on have been set up as part of the first step, they would then only include targets at a later stage in step 2. And I'll also come back to why that's a bit problematic later on. This is just kind of a visualization of this again, in case that's useful. It's kind of a similar point as on the last slide, in case you want to come back to this and find this setting more helpful. Now, the next slide is going to look a bit scary, so I think it's a bit overwhelming, so don't freak out. It's there for you to come back to if you want to. Because this sets out in a bit more detail as to what targets the Commission is currently planning for, or the direction of the thinking for the ecosystem-specific targets that they're planning in a first step. And the important point to note here is that the targets, or a lot of the targets that would come in place, would be based on Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive. So the Habitats Directive is a key piece of EU nature protection law, and it has an annex that lists certain habitat types. And I don't know the exact number of the habitats, it's a lot. And in principle, they are key ecosystems for nature and also for biodiversity and also for climate. So in principle, it's good that there's a focus on real nature and on real important ecosystems rather than just on kind of tiny steps to improve ecosystems everywhere. So the bulk of the ecosystem specific targets focus on Annex 1. That's the key first point. And then 2 other key points is that there's different targets that are currently thought about. So that's the A, B, and C on here. I'll focus on the first 2 because those ones are the ones that we also know a bit more about, and the third one is a bit vague. Those relate to restoring habitats that are currently not in a good status, so restoring degraded Annex 1 habitats, and restoring those to good condition, restoring a certain percentage thereof to good condition by 2030, 2040, and 2050. And a second target would be recreating habitats that are necessary to reach favorable conservation status of those Annex 1 habitats. So there's a few problems with those targets in the sense that it's that's why I said if this slide looks a bit confusing, it's because the targets are a bit confusing and it's not entirely clear exactly what area and so on they would relate to. And I think this is also, I'll come back in a bit more detail onto the issues with the current approach, but focusing a bit also now on what we would like to see. So as NGOs, I think as has also been mentioned in the beginning, really see this law as a major opportunity for biodiversity, but also for climate mitigation and adaptation, And with that, of course, for major health and well-being benefits, because of course we all depend on healthy ecosystems, our health, our well-being, our fundamental rights, etc. All depend on biodiversity and a resilient and functioning climate. So this law also, because there hasn't been a lot of nature legislation coming out of the EU in the last years or in the last decades, really is a big opportunity to make a real difference. However, for it to really have that impact, we think it's important that it restores a sufficient area of the EU land and sea and is really focused on area-based targets. So therefore, our key demand from the NGOs is that this law should restore 15% of the EU's land and sea area by 2030, and also restore 15% of the EU's overall river length by 2030. In addition to how the target should set up, from our side, it's really crucial that these new obligations are additional to existing obligations. So maybe that sounds quite obvious, but that is actually a big problem still with the law, that some of the obligations that are foreseen overlap with pre-existing ones. And I will come back to this in a bit more detail to explain this more, because I think that's a crucial point. The last one on here is that overarchingly, restoration should be seen as a way to bring about fundamental land and sea use change, rather than just tiny incremental improvements all across the EU. It should really focus on targeted measures that bring about fundamental changes and really lead to the effective management also of those areas. So having given a bit of an overview of the Commission's approach and what we would like to see, you can maybe already tell that what the Commission is planning is insufficient from our perspective at the moment, and there are still a lot of problems with the approach. So the first one is that the targets are not very clear. They refer to a percentage of degraded areas when it's not even entirely clear how much this degraded area is, and also when the figure for this degraded area fundamentally relies on member state reporting. So that makes it quite difficult to assess exactly how much would be restored, because it has these different targets that relate to different sub-figures of something being degraded or something being needed for favorable conservation status, and that makes it difficult to really have a bold target out there that would be easy to monitor, easy to hold member states accountable to, and easy to assess. However, with what we do know from, or what we can make out from this slight mess of targets, is that what is currently being proposed is just not ambitious enough. That's because the targets at the moment mostly focus on degraded areas, and that means that they don't focus on land area as such, but focus on a sub-proportion of the EU's land. And that means that if you translate this to how much EU land and sea area would actually be covered, you get something around 6 or 7% for the first target, so for a 30% restoration target of degraded Annex 1 habitats. And for the additional recreation target, you get something that's 0.0 something percent, so a tiny percentage of the EU's land. So really it doesn't cover a huge amount. The problem with the degraded areas is also that we've seen in the last strategy, so the biodiversity strategy up to 2020, that focusing on degraded areas really muddies the process, slows down the process, because first you have to really identify the areas that are degraded and have to define what it actually means. And that has been one of the reasons as to why a previous commitment up to 2020 to restore degraded areas failed to properly be implemented. The third point here, I've called it insufficient front loading, which sounds a bit odd, but what I mean with that is that the targets as they're proposed at the moment aren't necessarily linear, so they don't require enough action in the first few years, but kind of delay a lot of the action towards later decades. And of course, also from a young person's perspective, that's a bit problematic, because you're basically saying, well, it's difficult to do something now, so we'll delay it for later, maybe it'll get easier, but it won't get easier, it will get more expensive, it will get more difficult, and it will just exacerbate or continue to exacerbate the existing crisis. Then the third point on here on insufficient additionality means that from our perspective, some of the targets are not adequately additional to what's already required. And I'll explain a bit in more detail what that means in a second. And the fourth broader point of criticism relates to what is already included in this step 1 and what is delayed until step 2. So at the moment, the Commission doesn't foresee to include a rural restoration target in step 1, which claiming that there's not enough data, when we are saying, well, there is actually a lot of data available on where restoration action should be taking place. And there is also already a commitment in the biodiversity strategy to restore 25,000 kilometers of rivers by 2030. So as a minimum, you should at least integrate that into the law. So that's a bit an overview of the issues. And I would now briefly like to focus on the additionality point to explain a little bit more what that means, because it can be a bit technical. So the targets, if you have a target, or an example target to explain this is a target to restore a percentage of degraded Annex 1 habitats to good condition. So Annex 1 habitats, as I mentioned, are a list of habitats in the Habitats Directive. And the Habitats Directive also is crucial to establish what's called a Natura 2000 area. So that's a network of protected areas within the EU. And in a Natura 2000 area, you have obligations under Article 6 of the Habitats Directive to ensure favourable conservation status of that habitat. And that can mean all sorts of things, but it can also include restoring a habitat to ensure favourable conservation status. So with this graphic, I've tried to illustrate a bit that the broader circle, the lighter green, is Annex 1 habitats, and some of those Annex 1 habitats, not all, but a fair proportion of those habitats are also Natura 2000 areas. So in a greener dark circle is the area of overlap between Annex 1 and Natura 2000 areas, meaning that within those areas, there are pre-existing obligations to already restore ecosystems. So in the darker green, taking restoration action may not necessarily be additional to what you're already required to do. However, Natura 2000 areas are really crucial areas and habitats for biodiversity and climate. So we do want to encourage restoration action both within those areas, but also outside of them. So when we say, well, whatever you do needs to be additional, it needs to go beyond what is already required by the Habitats Directive. And I've tried to illustrate this a bit further. So if this is now zooming into your Natura 2000 area, that should be in favourable conservation status, so it should look like this. However, at the moment, it looks like this, because so the white thing being cut out refers to something, maybe a species or so, not being in favourable conservation status within that area, or you've not taken the appropriate measures to ensure that that species is in favourable conservation status. So if this is the case, you should be taking action to fill again the full green square to make sure that favourable conservation status is reached. But if now is this, so just plug the gap of what you've already been required to do by restoring a certain species and only taking the measure that's necessary for that species, then what you're doing is not additional to what you've already been required to do under the Habitats Directive, which has been around for almost 30 years. However, you can still take restoration measures within a Natura 2000 area and make sure that you go beyond what is already required if, for example, you restore what is necessary to restore to bring that species up to favourable conservation status, or the habitat, sorry, you do the necessary measures to ensure that the habitat for the species is in favourable conservation status, but you also go beyond that by, for example, creating additional habitats outside of the Natura 2000 area, or by taking additional measures for other species that also help to bring the broader habitat into a good condition. So this is to kind of illustrate a bit the additionality point as to why it's a problem, and also how you can make sure that while you still restore within Natura 2000 areas, you go beyond what is already required. because not going beyond what is already required is problematic from both a biodiversity perspective, because you don't really add to what you've already been required to do. You don't really take additional biodiversity measures, but it's also problematic from a rule of law perspective, because you're not implementing obligations that have been around for 30 years. You're extending the timeline in order to implement them, and you're just delaying what you should have been done already for what you should have been doing for a really long time. So I hope that, I don't know if that was helpful, but do let me know if if you have questions on that. But just to wrap up a bit, I hope I haven't run over too much already, or I don't know, I didn't pay too close attention to the time. On wrapping up a bit on what some of the key messages maybe are in terms of what this law can do and what we're still pushing for, is that it's important to remember and to really communicate that this law is really a once in a decade opportunity to really be a game changer for both biodiversity and climate. So it's not every day that you get to come up that there's an opportunity to come up with a new law. So this is really an opportunity that needs to be used to the fullest extent. It's also really an opportunity to put intergenerational equity into practice, to really also make up for damages in the past, and to restore ecosystems, to put them back into a better condition for younger and future generations. And so the law really is a big opportunity, and it also has a really positive message that can get broad civil society support. But in order for that to happen, there also needs to be clear and bold, ambitious targets that can get people excited and then can get the broad support that is needed for the law. So, because, I mentioned at the beginning, the law or the publication of the draft is delayed a bit, so there is still a little bit more time also for advocacy efforts. And youth also really play a crucial role in this. And there's already a lot that's been going on, and Julia will go into much more detail on that. But some of the key elements that we think are still really worthwhile to push, and where we also still see opportunities to make a difference, is to really push for an overarching area-based target of 15% of EU land and sea area. So really ensuring that while there may be ecosystem-specific targets, when you add all those up, that in each member state and EU-wide, you get to 15% of EU's land and sea restoration measures being taken by 2030. Then the second point on the additionality, I've tried to explain why it's crucial. So really trying to include a requirement for member states to make sure that any restoration measures they take are explicitly additional to what they've already been required to do. And the last point on here is that to really push that this law, this is a broader point maybe on the ambition as such, leads to real change by 2030 and brings about real measures on the ground by 2030, because the clock is really ticking. I don't need to remind anyone here, I think, about that. And we need to make sure that that adequate steps are already taken by 2030. And there is now also a very kind of concrete call to action, that there has been a letter put together within the coalition and mostly by WWF to send out a kind of high-level letter to Vice President Timmermans and the Environment Commissioner Sinkevičius to really call again for an ambitious, to make sure that this law is ambitious and to push in the overarching area-based target point. And we would really like to get as many NGOs to sign on to this letter as possible. So if you are part of an environmental NGO or a youth organization and can sign on to this letter, then please, I put the link, I can put the link also in the chat to sign on, because it's linked on the slide, but that doesn't help you because it's on the screen, where you can read the letter and also put down your organization to sign on, because we really think that still can have an impact. So I think these were the main points for me. If there are any questions, then do please feel free to ask. Or I'll hand over to Christella in terms of how exactly when the questions will be taken, but I'm happy to try to explain a bit more some of the points I've raised. So please do feel free to ask any questions. So thanks a lot for listening, and yes, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you a lot, Laura, for this detailed explanation of the legal process and also for the updates. Let's take the positive side of the delay on the proposal of the law. It will give time to make the necessary improvements on the already identified, let's say, challenges or complications as the proposal in this law brings with itself. Regarding the questions, the participants are already encouraged and welcome to put their questions or comments in the chat, and we'll read them and come back to that later after we finish with the talks from our guests. And I see that Chris is back. I'm very happy. I hope the connection will be stable now, and we'll have you during the length of your talk, at least. So just a brief introduction. So Chris is a member of the Society for Ecological Restoration, also lecturer at the University of Antwerp since 12 years, teaching habitat conservation and restoration. He's also a researcher and a policy advisor in the field of ecosystem restoration at the Research Institute for Nature and Forest. And while Laura talked to us about the legal aspects of this law, Chris will go into details, talking a bit of more the scientific side and the science perspective, and answering questions like, why is large-scale nature restoration needed, and what is actually ecological restoration? So, Chris, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, but I moved to another computer, and you should share. I can't share my PowerPoint at the moment, so if you give me the rights, I can give it a try again. Host disabled participant screen sharing, I should say.
Okay, just give me a moment.
It's because I moved to another computer, still the same problem. Host disabled participant screen share.
Now that you're a co-host, you should be able to share it. Could you give it a try?
Yes, we are there.
Okay, perfect.
So apologies for, I hope you see my screen now, and apologies for all the technical problems. My personal computer didn't want to the internet. I'm not on the computer, but in the same building, so hopefully that will stay connected. Yes, first of all, I represent the Society for Ecological Restoration. We are an NGO, globally working, and our main task is to exchange knowledge, not only between scientists, but also with the practitioners and the policy people. And we are kind of networks of networks in the sense that we try to connect with all the national networks that are already there working on restoration. And our main task is to really try to distribute and promote the best practices so that we can move on with restoration and make it more effective, more cost effective, and covering a larger scale. And so we have this scientific journal also, and you see our website if you want to know more about us. So first of all, I'm very glad for the opportunity to speak to you all, because you're an incredibly important piece of society. As we've seen with the climate debate, it's because of the youth action that we see that politicians start to move. Unfortunately, the wider public, and certainly not the politicians, are convinced of the urgency for doing something about our huge biodiversity crisis that we face during the last decades. So there is a challenge there, and hopefully you will be able to help us and achieve this ambition. So I will present a few general slides, not knowing exactly what your background and education is. So apologies if I repeat some things. The main message will be on the urgency of ecological restoration, and then a little bit more explanation on what we understand with the term restoration, and because there's a lot of confusion there. So yes, we know that 47% of the ecosystems have declined. 25% of our species are threatened or with extinction. And in our ecosystems, we see that the biotic integrity is declining very fast. And these are all alarming signals. And it comes down to the same thing that if you want to play a piano with half of your keys broken and the others all sounding false, then you will not be able to play a nice piece. So the same counts for our ecosystems. They become degraded more and more, and the functioning of the ecosystem or natural ecosystems on our planet are under severe pressure. And the main drivers, as you see in this graph published in Science, is that the main driver is because of land use change and exploitation of our natural resources. Climate change is an important driver, pollution, and then we have invasive alien species as the main causes of these biodiversity crisis. And so the human appropriation on net primary production on our planet is really exceeding the carrying capacity of our natural ecosystems. And here you see that Europe in this graph is champion of the world. So we are have this
I think we lost connection with Chris. I hope he'll be back soon. And we'll reconnect. Chris, we have you back. You are muted.
Yes.
We see your, yeah, you're still sharing your screen. We see it, and now we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, sorry. So let's move on quickly. So just want to say that according to United Nations report on achieving our strategic development goals, that 8 out of 12 of these strategic goals cannot be reached because of our biodiversity crisis. Next slide. No, it doesn't want. Yes, even the World Economic Forum has declared that the environmental problems are the most threatening ones at the global level for the economic life and future of our planet and human society. Globally, it is estimated that we need restoration of at least 2,200 million hectares. That's a lot. And if we see what kind of measures of restoration we need, it was calculated that all investments in this restoration is in fact not to be considered as a cost, but really something that pays back. And so this is for the different habitat types or ecosystem types that we need to restore at global level. And you see that the net positive benefits financially are larger than the initial costs for the repair. So, and we know that when we increase the effectiveness of the measures, that we can even make more advances with cost-benefit ratio. Very important is the link with the climate change agenda. So you all probably know this figure. It's the only model that shows the contribution of natural ecosystems in staying below the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, and that we want to achieve according to the Paris Agreement. So we need to stop all our fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions, and of course they stay a little rather long in the atmosphere, but they need to, as the years in the next 100 years, they need to go down, and we hope to get here, so well below the 1.5 Celsius degree, when we are able to restore all the land and marine ecosystems who are helping us in carbon sequestration. And of course, all the land use that is also responsible for greenhouse gas emissions has to stop as soon as possible. So this gives you an idea of the importance of the contribution of nature and the importance of nature restoration to achieve our climate agenda as well. Then at European level, we have all these protection already in place, and the Birds and Habitat Directive was already talked about by Laura. They protect 233 habitat types, more than 1,000 species. They cover more than 28,000 sites in Europe, covering 18% of the terrestrial area of Europe and approximately 10% of the marine area. So you would say, yes, well done, Europe. But what we see is that, in fact, the condition of most of the habitats is not good. And this is what you see in this graph. The member states have to report on the condition of the habitats, and here it is summarized as in green, good condition versus bad condition in red. And what you see overall for all the habitat types in Europe, more than 1/3 is in a really bad condition, and the majority in a poor condition. So this is illustrating the need for really active restoration measures. And when we divide a little bit the condition of our habitats over the different ecosystem groups, then what you see is that those that are most threatened are coastal habitats, the wetlands, bogs, mires and fens, dunes and grasslands. And I like to stress here the figure for forests. We know that many forests are under pressure for sure, but overall at the European level, forests are doing rather better than many other habitat types. Nevertheless, for the wider public and also in the climate debate, all we hear is we need more forests, while all these wetlands, coastal habitats and grasslands are also extremely important to combat climate change. And from the biodiversity point of view, they are even more important, so to say, than at the moment and than forests. So that's a point of attention, I think, for future actions that you could take in that respect. For the species, we can show the same perspective. A majority in bad or of the species that supposed to be in good status are in poor or bad status. And here you see division over different taxonomic groups. Then there was in 2015, this is a little bit an older study. There was an analysis what is needed to achieve good conservation status, and the conclusion was that for different biogeographical regions, so both terrestrial and marine geographic regions, we need to achieve this amount of restored land or additional area just to fulfill our legal obligations under the Birds and Habitat Directive, amounting up to 1.5 million square kilometers to be restored under the Birds and Habitat Directive. So a huge challenge. But when we see in reality what has happened, again, this is rather older data from 2014, but these are the most recent ones. So member states did not achieve the good conservation status and restoration. There have been a lot of restoration projects, but they advance very slowly and the progress is slow. Maximum 150,000 hectares per year, and while we need 150 million hectares, and as soon as possible. And to show the discrepancy, the distance to target. It's not that we don't know what to do. In fact, science and the ecologists very well know how to restore ecosystems. But what we learn from in this analysis here that you see here is that there are other barriers limiting the progress of ecological restoration in Europe, and they mainly have to do with more societal, legal, and political issues, and the funding problems, conflicting interests. Think about the conflict between agriculture and nature, for instance. It's not considered a political priority yet, or not enough. So there's not enough integrated planning. There's property rights are often something that hampers advancement of restoration. There's a lot of harmful subsidies. We lose nature in our agriculture areas paid by European taxpayers, and while we all understand that this is not sustainable agriculture, we need to restore, do restoration measures, still these harmful subsidies continue, and so on. So these are a list of really bottlenecks, barriers that we need to tackle if we want to be successful. There's one very important thing you have, as you may know, that well, in some parts of Europe the situation is better than others, but as a whole Europe encompasses landscapes that are very much fragmented. And so you see this map from the EEA, European Environmental Agency, and of course nature that is fragmented, populations of species that are divided and separated from each other. This is the perfect condition for extinction of species. So as a whole, we need to have much more attention for better connectivity between the areas. And the islands of protected areas, our Natura 2000 sites, for instance, will not be sufficient unless we are able to connect them, or as much as possible, at least. What is this? A blank slide? So, oh yes, this habitat leads to extinction depth. So this is a kind of vortex, a spiral of continuing extinction that is caused by fragmentation, because small population sizes, they are more susceptible to genetic inbreeding, and they are have a lower fitness and can not adapt to changing environments. Smaller areas, due to habitat loss, they suffer from more pressures from outside, so the habitat quality is lower and the populations are isolated, so there's no connection between the populations. So this is the perfect context for species extinction. And what we see is that now is climate change coming on top of this, and this poses a lot of problems. And we see that there is a real acceleration of extinction going on in all our European, even protected areas. So for the first part of my talk, some summary. So there is a quote for climate and life on Earth. Definitely, we need massive upscaling of protection and restoration. It's demonstrated that the socioeconomic benefits of conserving and restoring natural ecosystems is much larger than business as usual, as we do now. And so as a consequence, we need to significantly enlarge our efforts, and legislation needs to follow. And fortunately, we have this initiative of the European Commission now for the European Restoration Law, and hopefully Europe can pave the way also for the global agenda on restoration. So now a little bit more on the concept of restoration, because there's a lot of confusion, and our society promotes ecological restoration very much, with emphasizing the word ecological. And what it means is that, well, in fact, it's a process of assisting the recovery of a native ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And the word process is very important, because the current situation is on the left side of the graph, and degraded ecosystems. And we see that a lot of policymakers think that improving ecosystem management or ecosystem functioning is sufficient, and call it restoration, while it is not. And we call it, in fact, remediation or rehabilitation. And ecological restoration is really trying to achieve the highest recovery possible in terms of ecological in its ecological sense. And so in fact, what many people call restoration is nothing more than sustainable land use management. And ecological restoration is really about integrity, restoring the biodiversity of our ecosystems and restoring the resilience of ecosystems so that they can benefit also our delivery of ecosystem service that we need. This doesn't mean that on the left side, sustainable land use management is not important. Far from that, of course, and we need action there as well, but we should not call it restoration. So that's my main point of attention for today, maybe, and the difference between what we call restoration as a continuum and the importance of avoiding greenwashing and calling something restoration that in fact is only well, small improvements, reducing pressures from, for instance, a little bit less fertilization, a little bit less draining the land in agriculture, planting some trees here and there. So that's good, that are good things, but we should not call it restoration, certainly not ecological restoration. So the main challenge there is to define, to develop national plans, national strategies for restoration. And it's good if we divide it from the beginning. Urban ecosystems or agriculture ecosystems are typical cultural ecosystems, and clearly divide them from the natural and semi-natural ecosystems. And so we want to move back some natural ecosystems that were converted in cultural ecosystems. We want to return them in a more natural state, and that's the green arrow. And the artificial areas, so mining areas, artificial water bodies, landfill sites, they are somewhere in between. So the challenge for the coming years is to find an answer on where do we want to achieve what, how much, when, and how, and then putting money and other resources and capacity to really make that happen and achieve this really challenging restoration agenda for the future. I'd like to invite you to have a look at this publication of our society. It is endorsed by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Decade, and other organizations like IUCN. It's about standards and principles of good practice for the planning and implementation of ecological restoration. And you find a lot of details in it, how to plan and design restoration projects, what is the guidance for implementation, for monitoring, for reporting, and also for post-implementation maintenance, etc. So a few more words on restoration is that this process from a degraded ecosystem to a reference state and of a native natural ecosystem. It's from a non-functional to a functional ecosystem, and this graph really resembles the barriers that we have to break to achieve, to reach the reference situation. And so we first have to break the abiotic barrier, and because our abiotic conditions, water, air, soil, are often in a bad situation and need to make measures for restoration. But then, of course, the biotic barrier, so species have to come in and must be able to colonize your area to facilitate a full recovery of your ecosystem. This is also something that says the same. So natural quality from a degraded state to a good state where you want to reach over time. With a bad environmental quality, you will never reach your desirable state. With a moderate environmental quality, well, it will take you a lot of time maybe, or you will never reach it. So first of all, try to achieve good environmental quality and management, and then you can be very successful. So in terms of cost effectiveness, a lot of money and a lot of energy is lost because not enough investments were done in detecting the right measures that need to be taken first to adjust the environmental quality in your area. I want to illustrate a little bit the different approaches that are possible throughout Europe in terms of scale, naturalness, authenticity, spontaneity, for instance. So this could be a typical situation in Western Europe, an intensive agriculture area with the farm here and a degraded orchard, busy roads. The river here in the valley has been straightened, canalized. There's maize until the border of the river. All the small landscape elements disappeared, apart from these pollards. The grasslands in the valley, they are heavily grazed, overgrazed, and over fertilized. So there's really a degraded area. So imagine this is an area that you want to restore. What options do you have? And there are always different options. And that is sometimes the point of the discussion when you want to do the restoration project. Different stakeholders often have different visions of what target you want to achieve. And one option is this partial culture landscape idea, which is the most popular one when you ask the public or the local stakeholders, the local inhabitants of an area. When you talk to them about restoration, then they envision all most of the cases. This is what they like and want to restore. So we have here a grass strip along the river, and to reduce loss of nitrogen going into the water. We restored the row of pollard trees along the river, restored the orchard. There is a hedge around the farm, some trees along the road. We can have bike road and, well, a little bit less grassland, and the pond has been restored, and we have some farmland birds there that are returning, and maybe this is meadow now, a green pasture with some flowers in it. So this is what people like in most of the cases. But is this ecological restoration? Well, I tend to say this is just remediation or rehabilitation. This is just the beginning. And when you talk to ecologists, and this is a protected area, for instance, where biodiversity goals should come first, are the priority, then this is more likely the kind of landscape that we want to restore there with natural processes allowing for remeandering of the river. The whole valley is grassland or marshland back again. So the groundwater is again coming up in the area. The hydrology is restored. We have critical species that are coming back, like snake. This farm is still there, but he comes to our to a high nature value farm, and so the farmer has a lot of land where he grazes with his cows. These kind of mosaic landscapes which are becoming rich in biodiversity, and a lot of species are there, and he earns a living from that type of agriculture. And of course, the ultimate goal, and that is the non-intervention option, where we, in most places in Europe, terrestrial conditions, the climax vegetation is a forest, and these are, of course, things that you can do in large parts in Europe, where remote parts where the people are moving away from the countryside and moving to cities, and where there are no big other biodiversity arguments at stake. And so, like in Romania, you have these high biodiversity areas, wonderful meadows, wonderful tall grasslands, things like that. So if people move away, if the traditional agriculture practices there disappear, then of course you will lose all that biodiversity, and you may reach this type of landscape, but at the cost of a lot of important biodiversity that is threatened all over Europe. So that's always something that you should take into consideration. Okay, and this is again a graph illustrating always, if you want to restore, for instance, this valley, because the farmer left there, or you could purchase a piece of land there, always look at the landscape, what you need to do in order to restore the abiotic conditions. And this is an infiltration area that has been changed by urbanization, by intensive agriculture, by groundwater extraction. So the whole hydrology basically changed, and you must think very carefully when you define your target goals to restore this area in its former condition. And very often it's not possible to go back to that reference state, because of course it's hard to say to a politician, let's remove the houses here and remove groundwater extraction for drinking water, or remove agriculture in your area. So these are very important challenges all the time, and especially for wetlands that are dependent on these intact hydrology. I nearly finished, so I want to highlight also the importance of peatlands, because I think the importance is a little bit undervalued, especially among the wide public, and very few people know that Europe is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases originating from degraded peatlands, and we have about 300 square kilometers of peatland in Europe. And you must know that 15 centimeters of peat layer contains per hectare more carbon than tropical forest. And so very important carbon stocks are there in these peat soils, but we lose them at an enormous fast rate. And it is estimated that we lost about 90% of our intact peatlands so far. And more than 50% is really in a highly degraded state. So we need to do much more efforts in the coming years. And for me, that's really a priority for action. Hopefully you can help with that, to convince politicians that, well, this should something from the past, that all these organic soils, all these peatland soils are used for intensive agriculture with huge climate damage, and that can amount to and for the case of Germany, to 3.6 billion euros. And the farmers, to sustain this kind of practice they are doing, they receive 300 million euro of EU grants, public tax money. So why not using these 300 million euros to restore all these peatlands? I would say. So the way forward is to re-wet those areas. They become important areas for biodiversity, but also for ecosystem services. They can look like this as well. These are real-world examples of peatlands that were restored, and it's even possible to collaboration with farmers. Carbon farming, paludiculture is a valid option where there's some economic value for the farmer also in it, to re-wet all his peatlands. A huge problem where the Commission at this moment is not very fond of putting pressure on the member states is the Baltic states and Sweden and Finland, who are really important peatland areas worldwide, and a lot of these peatlands are drained deeply for intensive forestry, and most of these forests, a lot of them are harvested for so-called renewable energy, and the trees are just burned, root and all, and in power plants to produce electricity. And for that, this kind of forestry practice is still sustained over vast areas in the north of Europe. So we need to stop that and return these peatlands in their natural state, as you see below. There are other mistakes that are made, and everybody wants more forest, and these two ministers in Ireland, they had the brilliant idea to plant 500,000 trees on their bogs in Ireland, which of course is not a good thing, because all these trees, they cause a lot of evapotranspiration, so they will you get more greenhouse gas emissions due to the planting of these trees. So in short, and I think I exceeded my time, sorry for that. I'm looking forward to work together with all of you, and together, I think if we work all in the same directions, I think restoration agenda in Europe has a bright future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the amazing presentation. It was really nice to see that you illustrated the necessity for having the legally binding targets with all the maps and the statistics that we saw nicely visualized. And personally, I have now a clear idea on how the work that would be needs to be done in practice after the law passes from the European Parliament. It was really nice. Thank you again. And hopefully we made it on time. We still have Julia there with her talk. So as I said in the beginning, a big part, very important of this project is the advocacy work that WWF is doing with European youth organizations. And Julia has been working in something very important recently. And Julia, you can go ahead to tell us more about it.
Yeah, so to begin with, thanks a lot for both very insightful presentations, and thanks, Christella, for having invited me here to this event. So as you mentioned, I'm just going to bring the youth perspective, or more specifically, the youth environmental NGOs work that has been done regarding the upcoming restoration law. So I also have a presentation, and I'm just going to share my screen now. So I'm here representing Generation Climate Europe, and I'm just going to quickly give an overview of what the organization is. So it's basically the largest coalition of youth-led networks at the European level, with the common goal of pushing the EU for stronger action on climate and in general environmental issues. So we want to create a platform for the youth to advocate for a green and just transition at the European level. So we envision this system where human rights are respected, the planet is also respected, and the voice of the youth is included. These are all our member organizations. You probably are familiar with some of them. And as you can see, we represent a big amount of organizations and in general young Europeans. Since all combined, we gather over 20 million young Europeans. And the organization is operationalized through the work of our 5 working groups. And you can see there is one on clean mobility, circular economy, sustainable development, biodiversity, and climate justice. So I'm one of the coordinators of the Biodiversity Working Group, and specifically I've been taking care of the work on EU restoration law. And our last contribution has been this youth position on EU natural restoration law. So as you mentioned, the European Commission is going to set forward the binding targets for restoration, as was promised in the biodiversity strategy. And we, as youth, want to bring our perspective, and we want our voices to be heard when it comes to the negotiation of such an important law. So basically, GCE, Generation Climate Europe, drafted the first version of the position paper in spring 2021, in May to be specific. But in September, we decided to try to get other environmental European youth NGOs on board so that we could just present this document to the Commission and in general our position with a more cohesive and complete voice. So you can see here on the bottom left, actually, all the organizations or the youth organizations that contribute to our position paper, which are Biodiversity Action Europe, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network Europe, Youth and Environment Europe, and the Young Friends of the Earth Europe, and the Young Rewilders community. Our common goal is to protect nature and in general advocate for youth inclusions in this decision. So we just published this finalized version. You can find it on our website. And we are right now in the process of advocating it in the Commission. And we are, let's say, happy to hear that the Commission is delaying the process, so we have more time to try to influence them. But of course, when the process will go on to the Parliament and the Council, so we will also work there, and as well as we care about sharing and making clear our position to other stakeholders. So the premises that drove the creation of this position paper is that, well, spoiler alert, nature is in crisis. We've seen pretty gloomy data, and protecting what is left or even sustainable manage it's not enough. We also need to restore it. Ecosystems are vital for our health and well-being, and this law is an opportunity to go beyond the dichotomy of human versus nature that has always driven our nature policies to be short-sighted. And young people are important and it's to be included for a variety of reasons, but to begin with is that since we are going to be the ones living in the planet in the future, or for, let's say, longer period than someone else, we will be very much affected by current inaction and harmful activities. We can also help the development and knowledge of, and awareness around ecosystem restoration, since we will grow in this context, and we can teach in the future as well to our kids and future generations and so on. And also we have the knowledge how to restore ecosystems. Well, personally, I don't, but there are many examples all around the world and in Europe where there are young people that are engaged in local restoration projects and sometimes even lead them. And in our position, we have 3 demands that we want to advance at this stage to the Commission. So first of all is to have a genuine and full stakeholders engagement, especially on youth. So indigenous people, local communities and youth must be included in the process since the very beginning of the decision-making process, not just go there with already made a decision and then just ask for permission, but from the very beginning. Local communities specifically, since they actually are normally in the places where the restoration happens, not only are the ones that are impacted by restoration activities the most, but are also the one that can provide the most useful and pertinent insights on how to restore certain ecosystems, or at least provide context and the data and their perspective. National governments should, so while it's true that NGOs have a very important role and they should be included, national governments should do their fair share of work through also their own funds without relying or over-relying on NGOs, as it's been the case in many occasions. Yeah, and just to reiterate the thing, young people are not only stakeholders now, but we are also going to be in the future, so we must be empowered and enabled to act. The second demand actually, let's say, overlaps with what Laura said, which I think it's good, since we are aligned with the, let's say, non-youth NGOs when it comes to the topic. So this legislation, or in general legislation, must be coherent. So as you know, the environment is in an interdependent, so we can't have a conflicting legislation at the European level. So whenever the common agricultural policy is voted, or anything, any other tool not strictly related to the environment that can affect the environment is voted, then it needs to be, coherency must be guaranteed, and as well as coherent with the EU position on youth, which is very positive. Okay, so then include us. The new law must be additional to current obligations, as also Laura mentioned, that's extremely important. And the directives we rely on are all like 30 years old almost. I wasn't even born and we are still relying on them. So we need to really go beyond that as a rule, but now it's even an occasion to go beyond even more than we are supposed to. And then the efforts and the ambition must be linear. As also Laura mentioned, we echo this demand, considering that restoration needs to happen now, and efforts must be done in a way that it's not a last-minute work. This is not only disaligned with what nature requires, but it's even unfair towards young people, because this means that we will have to take care of it later in the years. And finally, our last demand regards funding, which is always the elephant in the room, like where do we get the money, how do we get the money to do this? With regards to that, we believe that funding and investments need to be aligned with policy priorities on ecosystem needs. And in particular, financing restoration is a cost-effective approach, because you can tackle biodiversity and the climate crisis together, but also provide income and job opportunities to young people, especially as well, and local communities and indigenous people. And this is just a golden occasion, especially now that we are recovering from the consequences of the pandemic. So funding should be accessible to and usable, especially for young people, which are, as you probably know, sometimes booked, and they're also always relied on volunteer work. And finally, even if a restoration fund is set up, or restoration funds in general, are meaningful only if, as I said before, there aren't conflicting forces. So if in a combined approach, which, for example, guarantee to track where the money is going, to phasing out harmful subsidies, to develop tax and a price system that reflect the environmental cost of how the product is produced, and also ensure that biodiversity, that investments are biodiversity proofs. So just to sum up, our idea is to we want a strong law to restore the ecosystem, because we want, of course, a strong environmental action, since our habitats are degrading. But at the same time, we think it's a matter of intergenerational equity, because we inherited the habitat as it is right now. So the least we can ask is to have a strong action to try to restore it. And that's all. I hope I stayed in time. And yeah, so thank you a lot for listening to this presentation. As always, if you have questions, just drop them in the chat as well.
Thank you, Julia, for the nice presentation. It's amazing the work that you've done. I kind of have been following it up through the review and consultation process, and it's nice that in the end you have the final version, and let's see how it will go in the next stages. Thank you very much. So we have about 7 minutes left. I don't know if any of the participants that stay with us until the end have any questions or comments to do. So I don't see anything in the chat. I want to ask you first if you have any comment. Okay, I see Alton. Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Nice to see you.
Thanks very much for the presentations. I know I missed about half an hour, but I caught Chris's and Julia's. Yeah, I suppose just a statement. It'd be great to I work with Eco-UNESCO in Ireland, and like work with the young people in the non-formal education sector. So definitely be sharing that youth position on EU nature restoration law with them, because we do have a lot of local action projects. So yeah, I think it'd be something that would be really useful for themselves. But just to Chris, I had a question in terms of agriculture. In Ireland, we've got agro environment schemes that have worked well. There's been mixed results depending on which type of agro-environment scheme was implemented. And what sort of role do you feel they play in restoring biodiversity? Obviously, farmers being one of the main guardians to biodiversity. But yeah, what sort of role do you think they play?
So in ecology, we consider these Western European agriculture systems as cultural ecosystems. So it means that there's a lot of human activity, and the activity is done with a purpose to gain money. And so we come from a time that the agriculture activities were more or less in balance with nature, and that there were a lot of typical so-called agricultural biodiversity values present in the landscape, and like certain birds. I'm sure you're familiar in Ireland with curlew and godwit and lapwings and things, birds like these. There are plenty of birds and also butterflies and all groups of animals that can sustain a population within those landscapes. So all efforts that are helpful to sustain that type of biodiversity. I'm also thinking about the pollinators debate, and it's in the best interest of the agriculture sector to sustain a kind of agriculture landscape where there is still room for these natural pollinators. So agro-environmental schemes are definitely useful to sustain the typical agro-biodiversity, but don't mistake them with natural ecosystems or semi-natural ecosystems. So at a certain point, if the agriculture becomes so low intense that all these specialist animals and plants that can sustain, then we consider that a line between the cultural and the semi-natural ecosystems. Well, it's a theoretical discussion, of course, because there's a gradient of activities in the landscape. So in general, I am in favor of the type of ecosystem of agri-environmental schemes that really are in favor of sustaining biodiversity within those landscapes. I'm not in favor of those type of measures that are also granted, where you have just a margin in the field that is plowed and sown with a mixture of alien flowers and non-native flowers, and call it restoration. That's also what is happening under agriculture environmental scheme. So that is, so it's not black and white. So I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but always look at the result in terms of biodiversity, and especially the species or the habitats that are in need for conservation and restoration. So if they benefit, then it's a good measure. But sometimes I argue that the amount of money that is spent on these agro-environmental schemes, after 10 years, in some cases you can buy the land with the same money, and you can manage it as a nature reserve from then on, which may be more cost efficient for preserving biodiversity.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the insight.
Okay.
Laura, you have an opinion on this topic?
I think you've covered it quite well, and I'm kind of conscious of the timing, so I don't want to add too much. Okay. But I think, yeah, thanks, Chris.
Okay, me personally, I had a question to Laura, but I want to keep it on time. I'll ask her personally, just to make sure we won't run late. It's a very specific question, so okay, I think, yeah, we don't have any more discussions. It was very interesting to listen to your presentation, to the three of you. Thanks, Elsie, for the intervention also now by the end. And thank you for making your time. I think, as Chris said, it's something that concerns us all, that we should be together and doing it. We need the lawyers, we need the scientists, we need the youth people to raise their voices also. And hopefully next time we'll meet when we already have the law, and to see what is the next phase and what sort of approach we'll do to the ecosystems in Europe for restoring them.
Good luck with all your activities, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you to all of you for being with us tonight.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for putting this together, Christella and Bartosz.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a nice evening, everyone. Goodbye.